Thank you, Linda. I want to give my heartfelt thanks to Linda and to all the folks at LARA. I think this is the fourth or fifth time the Prosecuting Attorneys Association has been invited to give a presentation on this topic, and we're very appreciative that LARA takes it so seriously, and all the good folks, all the turnout is always excellent at these, and frankly, it's usually better than a lot of our law enforcement training, so it's very heartwarming. On a personal note, I'll say that I'm very happy that I get to go before the rules sessions. So no matter how poorly I do this morning, at the end of the day, you'll think I did pretty good, hopefully by comparison. So again, as Linda said, my name is Ryan Painter. I'm with the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. In particular, I'm the director of the Elder Justice and At-Risk Adults Project at the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan. If you want to try and say that 3 times fast, you're welcome to try. So I'm a career prosecutor. My background was primarily in sex crimes, actually. So when I made the jump over to elder abuse, it seemed that I was simply jumping from one sort of vulnerable victim crime to another kind of vulnerable victim crime. But I found that actually handling a lot of these elder abuse cases and vulnerable adult cases, they tend to revolve around finances, right? They tend to be financial crimes, first and foremost. As much as the media tends to zero in on the really horrific physical stuff, the neglect stuff, the sexual abuse stuff, most of these cases are or have an element of financial abuse at their core. And that got me thinking about how we tackle these, and maybe the way we look at them is wrong, maybe the way law enforcement handles these cases is wrong. And so that has really informed the way that I do these presentations and the way I speak to audiences like you. And it continues to inform that going forward. It really does change the tenor of these cases. So as a brief introduction, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the Michigan Vulnerable Adult Statutes are and what we consider to be vulnerable adult. We'll talk a little bit about physical abuse because I do think it's intertwined with the financial abuse, but then most of the presentation is going to be about financial abuse. So MCL 750.145M and following statutes. Vulnerable adult is just someone over the age of 18 or older, okay? We don't criminalize elder abuse in Michigan. Let that sink in. We don't criminalize elder abuse in Michigan. We criminalize vulnerable adult abuse in Michigan. That's probably a lawyerly quibble. I'm a lawyer. I like to quibble. That's okay. But if you're 18 or over, and because of one of these following things, because of your age, there's no bright line age cutoff, although the legislature's looking at that, at changing that this year. Because of agedness, because of a developmental disability or mental illness, or because of some physical disability, you require supervision or personal care. You lack the independence, the ability to take care of your ADLs, your activities of daily living. That is really all we're talking about when we're talking about vulnerable adults in Michigan. It could be a 21-year-old who is a paraplegic because they were in a car accident. Their mental faculties are absolutely fine. Sometimes we have this mental picture of someone who's 95 and has severe dementia. That's what we think of when we think of elder abuse. But in Michigan, we don't criminalize elder abuse, we criminalize vulnerable adult abuse. And we'll see that the two are really pretty similar in a lot of ways. Generally, you break it down between physical and financial. So physical abuse, things like neglect, assault, abandonment. Financial abuse, things like embezzlement, theft, and scams. On the physical side, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I will say that in almost every single case of physical abuse or neglect that I've seen, and I've seen a lot, I honestly can't remember one that didn't have a financial component to it. What does this mean? It means that when we find physical abuse or neglect, we need to, all of us, be a lot better about looking at the financials and making sure that we're seeing the full picture. From a law enforcement perspective, I know there are far too many officers who will show up to a domestic at 2 o'clock in the morning. They write it up as a domestic, and that's all it gets charged as, which is just a misdemeanor. Domestic violence is a misdemeanor. Whereas if they had dug a little deeper, they might have found that there was a 20-year felony there because there'd been a long history of embezzlement and financial abuse. A lot of these financial cases are actually easier for us to prove, and you can get better sentences out of them than you can on the physical side. But because I think so many of us, and I'm really lecturing law enforcement. I know we don't have any law enforcement in the room other than my investigator, but that's what they tend to do. They kind of zero in on the stuff that they know, and they ignore the stuff that they don't know. And none of them understand financial crimes. So when you see physical abuse, when you see signs of physical abuse, and I know all of you, you're a retail business. You have direct contact with customers and clients. Be aware that suspicious bruising is a sign of abuse, and it could be a sign of financial abuse, even though that's kind of counterintuitive. I'm not going to go through that real detailed. I think you get the point. So financial abuse. Perpetrators, usually a family member, isn't always a family member. Oftentimes it is a family member, though. It's frequently impossible to recover from. And I think that one's pretty intuitive if you think about it. If someone's 30 years old and they get ripped off, they lose what little savings they have. In this generation, I don't think anyone who's 30 years old probably has any savings, but if you're 30 years old and you get ripped off, you've got the entire rest of your life, the whole rest of your career. Most of your productive years are actually ahead of you. I think I saw a study that we're most productive when we're in maybe our early 50s. So you've got plenty of time to recover from that. If you're 55, do you have time to recover from that? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly the quality of your life is going to be lower than it would have been. What if you're 75? Do you have time to recover from something like that? I've seen cases where people not only lose their nest egg and their investments, they have their own house quit-claimed out from underneath them. So this can be literally almost every single asset you have. And every year of age that you add on to that victim, the less and less likely it is that they can ever recover from that. So in many ways, these cases are far, far worse, and the outcomes are far, far worse for our victims than what I see in even some of the really bad physical and abuse cases and neglect cases. And I'm not trying to, I've had some people question me on that. I'm not trying to downplay how bad physical abuse is or how bad neglect is. Some of those cases are absolutely horrific. But I think about, this is the story I usually tell, I think about my own grandmother. Fortunately, she was not the victim of any kind of abuse that I'm aware of. But I think about the life that she led and the kind of person that she was, and I think she was pretty normal, pretty emblematic of her generation. She was born in the 20s. She actually just passed away last year. She lived to the ripe old age of 92. And she was in pretty good health, including pretty good mental health, right up until the end. Even her memory was pretty sharp, and we were very appreciative of that fact. But she was born in the 20s, and so she was a child of the Depression. She grew up through the Depression. When I was a little kid, I always used to wonder why, when I was playing in her house, she lived up in the Cadillac area, we'd go up and visit her. When I was playing in her house, I'd find these cans of off-brand vegetables all throughout the house. In fact, there was a back bathroom. It was just a half bathroom that was attached on the back of the house. It was an addition. And there was a little closet in there for towels and laundry and such. I would open that and I'd find a can of green beans. And I asked my mom about that, like, why does Grandma keep food all over the house? And she said, well, you know, when she was growing up, she was hungry all the time. People were hungry. A lot of people were very poor. She was very poor in the Depression. She never wanted to be hungry again. But think about the way that shapes someone's worldview. We're talking about people who were very hard workers. They're used to deprivation. They're used to saving. In her case, it was not just saving money and being careful how she spent her money. It was literally saving food, being careful, you know, what she bought. She would be very careful about not just throwing things away. She'd always try and have everything repaired because she thought that would save a little bit of money. Even though later in life she wasn't necessarily hurting for money, that was just the mindset. And then, of course, the war came. She worked at the bomber plant in Ypsilanti. And literally she was Rosie the Riveter. And my grandmother was really short. I mean, I think the tallest she ever was probably 5'1", and I think when she passed away, she was like 4'11". So I never understood how someone that small could lift one of those big rivet guns and sit there putting a plane together. I'd pay good money to go back in time and be able to see that. But she built planes while my grandfather was in the war. They weren't married yet, but they were an item. He was drafted early, so he was in North Africa. He was in Italy for a little while, and then he was in Germany before he finally came home. He was over there a long time. that was tough on both of them, you know, being out of contact. It's hard for my generation to really bring that home because we've never been through a long war like that with all that mobilization. They lived through that. They made it through. They came back, they got married, they had 4 kids, one of whom was my mom, raised them up. They owned a small general store in northern Michigan, never had a lot of money, raising 4 kids and working in a little general store that they lived above. It was out in the middle of nowhere. It's not like don't picture an urban store where you're living up above it. It was like a house that was turned into a store out in the middle of nowhere. And that was how they made their living. Now, my grandfather died of a heart attack in the 70s, 77. My grandmother just died last year. All that time, she was a widow. She never remarried. She lived on her own. Like I said, as far as I know, she was never a victim of abuse. But think about the effects of abuse on someone like my grandmother. Okay? Someone who I think is emblematic of that generation. Tough people. A lot of them are really tough people. Didn't really have a choice in the matter. They had to be tough. So physical abuse is bad. Neglect is bad. Have they been through worse than that? In many ways, they had. My grandmother, it was awfully tough to face her. I mean, she'd been through everything. She was a farm girl, you know, on top of everything else. I mentioned that her memory was good. She could still remember. There are a lot of things that she'd forget, but she could still remember growing up. She could remember the names of the horses that my great-grandfather had used to plow the field because they couldn't afford a tractor. This was way back in the 20s. They didn't have rural electrification like they do now, so a lot of the farms didn't even have electricity. And that was how she grew up. She grew up on a farm. So someone who's a farm gal, she's tough, she's been through the Depression, she's been through the war, she raised 4 kids, never had a lot of money. Physical abuse is bad, neglect is bad. But financial abuse to someone like that, and to someone like so many of our own parents and grandparents out there, is far worse. It really is. Because you're not just taking dollars and cents, right? In my grandmother's case, you'd be taking her pride. She never asked for a handout. She always made it on her own. You're taking that away from her. You're taking away her independence. What do elderly folks fear more than anything else? Losing their independence. Probably closely followed by not seeing the grandkids enough. But independence is right there at number 1. It's tough to take their driver's license away. It's hard on everybody. That's a really traumatic event in someone's life, to get to that point where you can't drive anymore. And your own family is often the one who has to confront you with that and take your driver's license from you. So losing even just the independence from not being able to drive. Now imagine losing all of your money. Okay, the nursing home you were thinking about going into, you might not be able to go into that nursing home. You had this many options because you had this much money. Now you don't have any money, so the options you have are what the government's going to give you. You took away choices. In my grandmother's case, she was still living in the same home that she and my grandfather had purchased after the store actually burned down. I'm not trying to make a really sad story, but they ended up moving into another home when they retired. That was the home that they raised their kids in when they were older, and she lived in that home right up until almost the day she died. Now, if you quit claimed that house out from underneath her, is it just a house? I mean, every room that she walked into had a memory. This was my son's bedroom growing up, or this was the room, this is our bedroom. And she'd say we, meaning she and her husband, who's been dead for 30 years. This is our bedroom. So these cases have incredible, incredible repercussions. You take all of that away from somebody, okay? The psychological damage is enormous. And I don't have the numbers to support this, but anecdotally I can say I've seen a number of cases where someone who's actually fairly young, maybe even in their 70s, they have a tremendous, tremendous financial fraud case like this. They don't come back from it. They're dead within a couple years. There was a case down in Ann Arbor a few years back. It's been a while. It's probably closer to 15 years ago. A fellow in a wheelchair wheeled himself in front of the Amtrak train. So suicide by Amtrak. Well, they found out he'd had an in-home nurse, caregiver person coming in. And she'd been doing that for a while and really helping him with a lot of things until he found out she was also helping herself to all of his money. She'd been made a power of attorney, and so she was ripping him off. He didn't even realize what was going on. Well, he found out that he had almost nothing left, all of his pride, all his independence, all of his choices, all out the window. It's a guy in a wheelchair in a little apartment in Ann Arbor living on his own. He didn't have any friends or family. And that was it. He just didn't have the will to go on. And when they checked his apartment, I talked to Brian Mackey, who's the prosecutor down there, and he said that they had, the cops went in and searched the apartment. They found the Amtrak schedule was right next to the phone. He must have called to double check and see that the train was coming, and he wheeled himself out in front of the train. I give this, I know this is a bit of a lecture, but I think it's worthwhile because I think too many of us in law enforcement gets this wrong all the time. Prosecutors get this wrong all the time. I think we have a hierarchy of cases. We say, you know, kids are number one, and then any other kind of violent crime is sort of number two, and bad sex abuse crimes are right up there at number two. And, you know, these financial crimes or so-called victimless crimes are kind of way down here. We just don't pay them as much attention as we should. These absolutely have a victim, and they're every bit as bad as any of the worst physical abuse or neglect cases you've seen. They really are. We have to take these seriously. And that means that everyone who can pitch in and can help stop this before it becomes too hard to come back from, you're on deck. Because we're not going to be able to do it this isn't just a law enforcement issue. So that's my lecture on that. Take it for what it's worth. Someone who can speak about this, and this is really a great video. It's real short, I promise. But Mickey Rooney, before he passed away, actually testified to Congress. He was a victim of elder abuse, in particular financial abuse, and he does a really great job. It's just a 2-minute clip, but I think it's worth listening to Mickey.
I was unable to avoid becoming a victim of elder abuse. Elder abuse comes in many, many different forms: physical abuse, emotional abuse, and financial abuse. When that happens, you feel scared, disappointed, yes, and angry. And you can't believe that it's happening to you. You feel overwhelmed. When I asked for information, I was told that I couldn't have any information of my own. What the hell were you talking about? I was told it was none of my business. And that it's none of my business, and when you're told that, you're left to leave powerless. For years, I suffered silently. I didn't want to tell anybody. I couldn't muster the courage. And you have to have courage I need help. And I knew I needed it. Even when I tried to speak up, I was told to shut up and be quiet. You don't know what you're talking about. It seemed that no one wanted to believe me. And if it can happen to me, oh, God willing it and unwilling it, it can happen to anyone. I know who I'm talking about. And I'm not speaking just for myself, or what I hope to be, or what I was taken from me. I'm asking you to stop this of elderly abuse. I mean, to stop it.
So what's great about that video, first of all, you see a little bit of the old actor coming out, and I really appreciate that he was able to come in and testify like that, because it is pretty powerful. But he focuses on some interesting issues. Seniors are very seldom willing to come forward about this, in particular financial abuse, because who wants to admit that their own son or daughter, grandson, granddaughter is ripping them off? Is my grandmother, would she, if I was ripping her off, would she have gone to church and they're all sitting around talking and she said, you know, oh, my grandson? Oh, well, he's been ripping me off. That's what's new in my life. Do you think if a senior citizen turns to their grown son or daughter who's been taking advantage of them and asks them to stop or tries to force them to stop, what do you think the leverage is going to be on the part of the son or daughter? Grandkids, number one. If you ever want to see the grandkids again, and you're 80 years old, so it's not like you've got a lot of time left to see them, then you're going to help me out. It's going to be my money anyway. So why don't you just give me the money I need for mortgage, truck repairs, debt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's to the point where even if law enforcement, you know, Tom said these cases, you go and you ask the victim, well, did you give them permission? Do you want this to be the case? Do you understand that you're losing your nest egg? You know, we run through all of them, make sure they understand what's happening to them. And you can tell they're upset about it. But when they say, well, look, you know, I don't feel like I have the choice. Because my grandkids are more important to me. My family's more important to me. I want to have some kind of a relationship with my son or my daughter. And, you know, they're probably right. It probably is going to be their money anyway. Frankly, for some of them, and we've even seen this in cases where the perpetrator's not a family member. Sometimes it's some completely unrelated caregiver. We've seen this with neighbors who become very involved in the lives of a senior citizen neighbor of theirs, and they sort of insinuate themselves into this person's life. It's almost like the grooming behavior you see in some of the sex crimes against children. It's not exactly identical, but there's some of those elements. You kind of groom them and you mold them, and eventually you convince them that you're trustworthy, and then you start taking advantage of them because you got your name of their bank account, or you got a power of attorney, or whatever other little trick you use to get your claws into them. But what is the senior citizen getting out of that? It's not just help or aid or whatever. It's companionship. We have a real problem with loneliness in America in general, but in particular amongst our senior population. This makes them much more likely to be victimized, particularly in financial crimes. Okay, because it's so easy to want to trust someone, to want to be friends with someone, to want to have someone you can talk to. I think we've all experienced that. Maybe you've had an elderly client who it's kind of tough to shoo them out the door or get them off the phone just because, you know, they don't have anyone else to talk to. And so they have a tendency to want to talk to you. I know when I was in private, the very brief time I was in private practice, I had that happen numerous times. I did a lot of bankruptcy work, and I had a lot of senior citizens who were filing bankruptcy. Largely it was because of medical debt. And so I would spend a lot more time on the phone than I was supposed to, and I certainly couldn't bill for it because I was just talking to them. And if I had time in my schedule, I'd try and make time for them because I always felt bad that they didn't have anyone else in their life to talk to but a bankruptcy attorney. Isn't that incredibly sad? But it really is. It is. It's sad. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the other kinds of financial abuse and scams, and then at the end we'll circle back around to my primary focus on some of the tools that abusers use, how to spot them, and maybe what to do when we discover them. So financial abuse by strangers, excuse me, we usually refer to this as scams, scammers. I think we all are pretty aware that they're out there. They're smarter than ever. They certainly focus on senior citizens. And beyond just scammers, frankly, anyone who's asking for a buck, you're going to focus on the senior population. My own parents are in their 70s, and when I go over to their house, the pile of mail that they get is incredible. I don't get mail. I get a lot of emails, spam. But the mail that I get, they're almost entirely bills, occasional magazine or something, or the newspaper. My parents, they get letters asking for a handout from every single nonprofit, I'm pretty sure in Michigan, and then some. And you can't help but wonder if some of those are actually scams. They're illegitimate nonprofits, because we know some of those are out there too. But they do. They tend to focus in on seniors, predatory sales techniques, the same kind of stuff that you see, you know, a used car dealer or any other kind of high-pressure salesperson use. Those same kind of techniques can be used by scammers and to much worse effect. It is pretty incredible when you think about it until you stop and realize that you're talking about a population that, for some of them, maybe they have early undiagnosed Alzheimer's, dementia. They have the effects of cognitive aging, which are normal for all of us, and so all of us will start to kind of slow down a little bit as we age. And actually, that usually starts around the age of 60, which is frighteningly young. My good friend Peter Lichtenberg is a professor at Wayne State as a gerontologist. He's the director of their gerontology department. And he always, he always tells about how all the latest studies tend to indicate that age seems to drop every couple of years. They come up with a new age, and now I think it's actually closer to 58 or 59 for most of us. We begin to, we may not notice it, but we start to suffer the effects of just cognitive aging. This is beyond any sort of disease or other issue. So that's really, you know, I hope you all had a lot of coffee, because there's a lot of negativity to get through this morning. So the scammers are out there. Unfortunately, our seniors are much more likely to be victimized. According to the numbers, these are a couple years old. This is from FINRA. Most of you probably know what FINRA is, the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. They have a great website, and they've got a lot of free material you can get from them too, which is really excellent. They estimate probably 8 in 10 seniors have been solicited for potentially fraudulent offers in any given calendar year. I actually think it's probably closer to 100%. They estimate about $50 billion is lost every year to elder fraud. Now, I think that number's from 2016, so it's only gone up from then. And to give you some context, in this age where we have, you know, $2 trillion budgets and $50 billion doesn't seem like a lot of money, that's just about double the state GDP for the state of Vermont. Vermont, I think, when I checked Wikipedia, was about $26 billion. Admittedly a small state. But $50 billion being, you know, almost twice what a state economy is worth in a given year, I think that gives you an idea of just how huge this problem is. If you're 65 or older, not only are you more likely to be targeted, you're about 34% more likely to lose money than someone who's targeted when they're in their 40s. And that's for a variety of reasons. Some of it is because you've got folks in that age bracket who are suffering from dementia, from Alzheimer's. Some of it, they're people who are lonely, and so they're emotionally not equipped to fight off fraudsters. But for a variety of reasons, they're not only are they more likely to be targeted and more likely to lose money, but because most of our wealth in this country is tied up in those who are skew older, that really is where the focus is, and so they have more money to lose, which is also quite frightening.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have...
Okay, so before I start this, or start it back up, just because I've been so negative, this is a video, this is actually from FINRA. This is part of a video series they did. It's supposed to be sort of humorous, so we can have a good laugh at it. But as we watch it, I want you to do a little homework. Be aware that this guy's sort of a spoof on QVC, and so he's trying to sell a product. Now imagine that you have a client who's a senior citizen and kind of watch the video keeping them in mind. What sort of sales techniques would they respond to? And I'll even use the term be tricked by into purchasing a product that they either don't need or isn't a good product. And then at the end we'll circle back around and we'll identify what some of those were, and we'll think about the way those are misused against seniors in our careers.
To tell you that I have never seen anything that we have ever offered here on the Smart Shopping Network that is getting the response we are getting tonight for the Miracle Shim. Look at that. Isn't that attractive? And if you have a chair or a table at home that's a little tipsy, and I bet a lot of you do, there is no better product you can find than the Miracle Shim. Now, look at this chair here. A little tipsy, isn't it? You probably have one like it. But you just slip one of these little beauties right under that chair or table leg that's not quite touching the floor as well as the others, and voila, problem is solved. Now, isn't that something you need just about every day? Yeah, I know I do. These are the same shims used in the White House, Buckingham Palace, the Taj Mahal has lots of them, and all of Donald Trump's homes too, every single one of them, and he has a lot of them. You know, Princess Diana, it is said, would not sit at a table until it had been specially leveled with Miracle Shims. She had a guy with her, went with her all the time. He had a bag full of shims. True story, true story. Now that is class. Now I'm going to be honest with you. You cannot find Miracle Shim in the stores. You just can't. They're not available in stores. They're not available from anywhere but right here, right now, from me. And they're not going to be here long either, believe me. If you were lucky enough, though, to find them, you would expect to pay over $200 for a set like the one we are offering here tonight. But that's not what you will pay if you order right now. No, we are offering the Miracle Shim for just $49.90. Did you hear what I said? Or 5 easy payments of just $9.98. Now that is more than half off the list price. And again, it is just $9.98 regardless of whether you want the cedar, the pine, the oak, or the hickory. Now that is just unreal. I have these at my house. I also gave a lot of them as Christmas gifts this year too. My mom loves hers. You know what? She got the cedar set and she doesn't have any more tipsy chairs or tables. She also doesn't have any more moths. Okay, I'm told the hickory now is really selling like hotcakes. So let's take a look at the counter and, whoa, my goodness, over 12,000 sold just since I've been on the air. These sets sold out completely last time we had them on the air, so I'm not surprised by that. We have got Bernie from Normal, Illinois on the line. How are you, my friend?
Hi, I just called to say that I love my Miracle Shims.
Do you now?
I just bought 3 more of them tonight.
Whew, 3 of them.
Yeah, and my neighbor's trying to get through to you right now to buy some.
Well, you better hurry because I'm told the cedar just sold out.
I bought one for my wife. Our anniversary's coming up.
Well, your wife has herself one thoughtful husband.
Yeah, well, you know, it sure beats buying a new dining room set.
Well, thank you, Bernie. And you know, he raises a very good point, folks. New dining room set, several $100s. You want to impress your friends. You want to feel real elegance in your life. You want to sit at your table.
Okay, I think that's good. So that was humorous, but why would FINRA make a video like this? Well, let's look at some of the techniques that we see here, and we see these in the real deal too. Seniors do like to buy stuff online. God bless my mom. She's at that point where she buys a lot of stuff off of QVC. And when I was doing bankruptcy work, I had an older woman that filed bankruptcy. She had a bunch of credit card debt on top of some medical bills. She owned her house, though, outright. And I was a little worried that we wouldn't have enough to cover the house. We might have to lose some of the value to the trustee, but the trustee was reasonable. We were able to skirt that through. And so we had a very, very good Chapter 7. And by the time the thing was over, she really had mobility problems, couldn't walk well. So I went over to her house with some paperwork, and she was sitting there on the couch. She smoked like a chimney, and her mom, who must have been 100, was sitting on the couch next to her. They had these little dogs running around. What did they have on? I just got rid of probably $30,000 worth of credit card debt. They were on QVC. The phone was right there. Of course, they didn't have a cell phone. It was a landline phone right there on the couch next to them. I thought, oh, it is what it is. But look at this stuff. You've got a perceived savings. Now, there's no way these things are worth $200 or even $50, but you think you're saving money. Easy payments. That's a classic. You're deferring into the future that pain to your wallet, right? You're pushing it off into the future. That's why we can make these little payments on something so cheap to begin with, because it looks even cheaper to us. Well, I only have to cough up $10 right now. Everything else is deferred into the future. Orders today. Social pressure. Everybody else is doing it. You don't seem to have too many door-to-door salesmen like you used to, but if you've ever had anyone come to your door, what's one of the first things they say to you? Oh, it's just at your neighbor's house. They bought a whole set of whatever it is I'm selling. Encyclopedias, yeah. I don't know if they still make encyclopedias, but I remember when I was a kid we had encyclopedia salesmen. Yeah, you're right. That's what they would do. They'd say all your neighbors bought one. Scarcity. You got to hurry up and get them because they're selling out. In fact, 2 of these have sold out already, right? Scarcity. Hurry up and buy now. Don't stop and think about what you're doing. Just hurry up and buy it. And then, to create anxiety, there's a counter over here. It's counting down. I don't know what it's counting down. Maybe they're going to launch a rocket when this is all said and done, but it's counting down, you know, and so psychologically that plays in your mind. I got to hurry up. I got to hurry up and buy whatever it is that I need to buy. These kinds of techniques are used by scammers. The same concepts, the same mindset as the folks on Madison Avenue who come up with all this stuff. They use all of this. Whether it's some email scam or increasingly a lot of the really rotten phone scams are so incredibly believable. I actually live in Shiawassee County, just east of here. My county was in the news. Was that last year, Tom, when they were defrauded? Yeah. They had an email scam come into the county treasurer's office. And they thought it was an email from one of the commissioners telling them to wire $50,000 to some vendor. And that's not normal procedure. I'm sure for any county that's not normal procedure. Well, the deputy treasurer emailed back, of course, to that same email address that had come in and said, "Are you sure you want me to do that?" And the commissioner said, yes, we need to hurry up and get this paid. She issued the wire transfer. Now, it was probably 2 hours later, they found out what had happened. By then, the money had already come out. The money was gone. They weren't able to get it back, so the county was out $50,000. She was promptly fired before the day was out. I don't know whether any controls are put in place to prevent that from happening again, but so this is a unit of local government just got ripped off. Now, say what you will about the quality of our local government, but I think at the very least we can draw from that. If governments are being ripped off, if local units of government are being defrauded by these scams, then certainly our seniors and our vulnerable adults are easy prey for this stuff. Now, a lot of this happens so fast, there's really no good way to stop it. But I think all of us have had someone come and ask us about these. I know we get calls, Tom, my investigator, and I get calls about this from time to time. And I know our local officers and local departments sometimes encounter folks who have questions about these kinds of cases. And we really, really need to be good educators, good financial educators, because there's so many people who just, they don't understand, they get taken advantage of. And like I said at the beginning of this whole thing, once the money's gone, it's gone. They're not going to be a greeter at Walmart for 35 years to try and recover their nest egg. It isn't going to happen. So that's what I'll say about scammers. So some of the tips we need to avoid, some of the things we need to focus in on. I could just as easily, excuse me, I could call this my list of pet peeves. Power of attorney. This is a big one. This is like the devil's favorite document. It has to be. Power of attorney is such a useful creation. It's such a useful tool. But have we ever stopped to realize why it's so useful? It's because it's so incredibly powerful. You're potentially giving full legal authority to someone to act entirely in your stead, to be your attorney in fact, right? This person, a poorly crafted power of attorney, can allow them to do practically anything. And that's exactly what we have. We have folks running around with a power of attorney that they found on the internet. Print this sucker off, they sign it, they think they're all good to go. And then it's a license to steal to them. Well, let's talk about the state of law in Michigan and clear up maybe some misperceptions. First of all, and cops and prosecutors both really just don't get this one, but a power of attorney creates a fiduciary duty, right? We all know, in this room, we all know what a fiduciary duty is. So you have to act in the best interests and at the direction of the principal. However, what about a power of attorney that has a gift-giving provision? Well, again, if you go back to the state of law in Michigan, even a gift-giving provision is viewed through the prism of fiduciary duty. So I'll give you an example, a couple examples. If you have, let's say I get a power of attorney for my mom. She's always given gifts to my kids, her grandkids, at Christmas. Let's say $50 a piece. I've got 2 kids. And that's gone on for, well, Noah's 5 years old. That's gone on for 5 years. And let's say that goes on for a few more years and then I get this power of attorney. If I continue giving gifts under the gift-giving provision to my own kids, it looks like self-dealing. But there's a historical pattern there. It's a small amount in comparison to the overall value of her assets. So it's clearly not going to diminish her assets or cause her any trouble. And it would seem that it benefits her, not necessarily financially, but it does benefit her to continue to have a good relationship with her grandkids at a very, very small, almost de minimis amount. Then absolutely, not a problem. Me as a prosecutor, there's no way I can prosecute that. It's not a crime. Well, now, what if in the same example she's used to giving $50 at Christmas to her grandkids? Now I'm the power of attorney, and suddenly I say, oh, well, Grandma's decided to be very generous this Christmas, and she's going to pay for your college. So let's just move all that money out and put it over in this account over here for college. Is that a violation of the terms of the power of attorney? Is that a violation of the fiduciary duty? What if there's a gift-giving provision that doesn't have any upper limit on it? It just says there's the power to give gifts. Would that be a violation? Yes. Because you're a fiduciary. How does that benefit the principal? Regardless of the fact that there's some gift-giving provision, gift-giving provision is exactly for the scenario I just gave you. It's to give gifts in small amounts per the historical pattern of the person whose money it belongs to. It's not a license to steal. It's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. I can't tell you the number of cases we come across where someone's misusing a power of attorney, and that's their very first defense is, well, I had a power of attorney. And their second defense is, and it has a gift-giving provision in it. Well, my answer is usually, so what, and big deal. Because we can go after those cases. Those are actually pretty easy to prosecute. Another nice thing about power of attorney, at least since 2012, when the statute changed, not only is the fiduciary duty language now explicit, there's boilerplate in all of our new power of attorneys since then. Excuse me. But it actually forbids gifts unless there is specifically a gift-giving provision in the power of attorney. It has to be spelled out, whereas before it was implied. So it's far from being what a lot of fraudsters think it is. Not only that, but there is now a duty, an explicit duty, to keep records. And they have to turn it over to the principal upon request. I can't tell you the wonderful feeling, I mean, it really warms your heart when that big, tall, scary investigator turns to this guy who's been ripping off his own mom for years and says, oh, you have a power of attorney? Okay. Well, if you could just round up all your receipts for me, and I'm sure you have those on hand, and you can drop them off at the station tomorrow morning. Deer in the headlights. Receipts, what? Records, huh? I was just spending this as if it was my own money. If they were serious about their fiduciary duty, they would keep the records that they're required by law to keep. They never do. The bad ones never do. Joint bank accounts. This is another big one. Everyone seems to think that magically, if I go and put my name on someone else's bank account, now we have a joint bank account, that we co-own those assets equally, and that I can spend all the money out of that account as if it were my own, because it is my own, right? They put me on their account, and so I have equal ownership of all the money in that account. That is not true at all. A joint bank account is the same thing as the little tiny refrigerator you had when you were in college, right? You and your roommate own that thing jointly, and if I bring home pizza and beer and stick it in there, it's still my pizza and beer. And if you have your grease-wad friends over the night before and drink all my beer and eat all my pizza, I wake up in the morning, I'm going to be ticked off because that was my beer and my pizza, even though we owned that fridge jointly. Joint bank accounts, the same thing in Michigan. There's plenty of case law. It's mostly civil case law on this. There is actually a criminal statute, though, embezzlement from a jointly owned asset. So what we do as law enforcement, we go back and we look, and we'll get bank records that go back as far as we need them to go. And we'll see exactly who put that money in there. And 90% of the time, here's what we see. We see a senior citizen and whoever the deadbeat is, whether it's son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, whomever. All the money going in is coming from Social Security, maybe a pension, maybe an annuity. It's like one or two little streams, and they're all going in there, and it's every month, and it's exactly the same dollar amount. And it goes on like this in perpetuity. And what do we see coming out? Before the bad person gets involved, we see the money goes in, she goes down. It is usually women because they live longer than us. Men don't live quite long enough to be as victimized in these cases as women. So women, I guess you kind of win the lottery here. You're lucky enough, you live longer than us, so now you get to be victims more than us. I don't know what to say about that, but she'll go down, she'll take some money out so she can get her hair done, maybe have some money for church, have some money to put gas in the car. This is just what we see. These are patterns. I'm not trying to draw any sort of anything from that, but we see that month after month after month. The spending patterns are the same, right? This much money goes in, this much money comes out. There's usually just a tiny little bit of savings in there. Deadbeat son, unemployed son, now has the joint bank account, is going to help mom out. Now what do we see? There's no more money going in. He's not putting any money in because he has no money to put in. But we see large sums of money coming out. And whereas before they were almost always checks, or sometimes checks written to cash, now we see large ATM withdrawals. Maybe now there's a bank card, and so we're seeing lots of debit card expenditures. Not only has the amount of money gone up, the manner of spending has changed. It's become, I don't want to use the word sophisticated, it's become more modern. We see this over and over and over again. And they think it's a joint bank account. It means I own the money in there. If they really thought that, they would declare that as taxes. They would declare that on their taxes because it's income. It's a taxable event. If you just got your name added to an account with $50,000 cash in it, and you think that that now makes it yours, where's the part where you declare that as income? How many times have I seen a case where they did declare that as income? Anyone want to hazard a guess? If you guessed more than one, you lose. I've not seen a single one. And in case you think that this is just a toothless threat, before it kind of was, Treasury had better things to do. I have a good friend in the Attorney General's office, and we've leaned on them. And they actually, the Attorney General now has a contract with Michigan's Treasury. We can't get the IRS to do anything, but in Michigan at least, our Michigan Treasury has now started prosecuting these. And I think last year we had like 5 or 6 of these cases, almost exactly the same pattern, where the IRS brought an action with the Attorney General as their lawyer. My good friend Scott Teeters, head of the elder abuse unit at the AG's office. And that guy, he's a nightmare to be on the other end of the phone from him, because I think he was calling someone at Treasury probably 2 or 3 times a day until they finally gave in. We're prosecuting these cases now, ultimately, is the end result. It's just wonderful. You can't have your cake and eat it too. If you're going to rip off from a joint bank account, then either you declare it as income, of course it's not income, or you admit that you're just embezzling something you don't own, which is exactly what it is. It's always been that way under our civil law. There's a long history of civil case decisions going back decades. But in terms of the criminal law mentality, we're sort of just now catching up to that. I'll talk briefly about trusts. I don't pretend to be a trust and estates lawyer. I will say that trusts are very, very dangerous tools. Attorneys love to sell trusts because they're usually not that hard to set up, and you can bill a lot of money for them. And it's not to say that attorneys are bad or that they're trying to victimize their clients, but I think all too often you have a situation where someone excuse me, doesn't really know what they want or really hasn't given enough serious thought about their situation. They're trying to plan for their future, and they're trying to plan for their beneficiaries after they pass. Maybe they're trying to plan for their own spouse. What happens when I die? You know, how's my wife going to carry on? Or maybe they have, in my case, my son has Down syndrome, so maybe I need to set up a trust for him after I pass away. You have to bring all these facts to your attorney, and you really have to do your due diligence as a customer with your attorney to make sure that they understand your situation, and they're not just sort of fawning off on you this random same trust that looks 90% the same as everybody else's trust, right? Because all too often you can wind up in a situation where you've now taken most of your assets, you've locked them away in a way that makes it hard for you to get at them, and you've lost some control over your own money. And you have to be very careful who that trustee is and what sort of things they're empowered to do or not do with your trust. It can really screw things up. A good friend of mine is an estates lawyer who I've had come speak to audiences, a lot of our trainings, and his quote, and I've got it down here at the bottom: money equals choices. That's true in life, but it's especially true late in life. The more money you have, the more choices you have, right? You're not condemned to the nursing home that Medicare or Medicaid's going to pay for. You have money, so you've got options. You can buy up, you can buy better, you can have better insurance, you can have a better lifestyle, you can have more help, you can do this, you can do that. So the last thing you want to do is to lose control over your money. Trust can be very, very useful and very, very helpful, but all too often we get people, it's the same thing as a power of attorney. Power of attorney in and of itself is not a bad thing. but we're lazy, we're intellectually lazy, we misuse them, we don't know what we're buying, and yet we buy it anyway, and we get something that doesn't work the way we wanted it to work. And that's on all of us. We all have to do better, planning for ourselves, planning for the people that need us to plan for them. We need to be aware of what these things are and make sure we're buying what we intend to buy. That second to last one there, don't be pressured into giving away your stuff. Usually that's in the context of law enforcement just got a call from some caregiver, oftentimes it's in a nursing home or an assisted living facility or whatever, and they're mad that they can't get, they can't get their payment, or there's some issue about qualifying, and it's because somewhere along the way, the old person's, the senior citizen's family decided that, well, we need to get all your stuff, we need to give it away, to us, of course. Kind of sort of half-assed, excuse my French, half-assed end-of-life planning. You know, we want to defraud the government here. We want to make sure that they're going to pick up the tab, and so we've got to get your assets down below a certain level. And so what do we see them doing? They start giving their funds away. They start, we see quit claims of their house, you know, to their son or daughter. All of the stuff that they own is frittered away quickly. And the defense we get on the law enforcement end, when we look at this and we think it's fraud, well, it's a spend down. In fact, we even talked to an attorney about this. It's a spend down, and it's all above board and it's all legal. Well, I'm not going to punish you for your defrauding of the federal government. That's not my job, and I'm not interested in protecting federal money. I'll let them sort those cases out. But that stinks. Those cases really stink. And I can tell you that while there are some of those cases we haven't been able to prosecute, when we see that sort of a situation, we're going to look at that very, very carefully. And we're going to see if there's any way we can get that money back and get those assets back in the name of the senior citizen. There is a time and a place for proper end-of-life planning. But when the family takes it upon itself to clean her out, and their defense is, well, we got to preserve that money so it doesn't get frittered away, being spent on things like her care or, you know, potentially going to taxes, you know, that starts to make me wonder. That's something you should have done earlier. You should have talked to a reputable attorney and probably an accountant and made sure you planned accordingly, rather than just let your family sort of take advantage of you. Because again, now you're in a situation where you don't have any money, and what does that mean? You don't have any choices. So we see that all too often. Those are the list of the things that really kind of get my goat. We have a little bit of time left for questions. After we take questions here, I do want to introduce my investigator. I've been referring to him, the fellow in the blue shirt. Tom, if you want to raise your hand. Tom Holcomb works with me. He's our vulnerable adult investigator at the Prosecuting Attorneys Association. And so he does actually investigate some of these crimes directly. He's a 30-year retired police detective, and then he came to work for us as our in-house investigator. Most of the cases that he works on because he was referred by a local agency, whether it's a prosecutor's office or a police department, or even sometimes local APS regional office. He'll take a look at the case, he'll write up what he has, maybe look at some of the evidence, and then generally what we do is we send it back to whatever local agency it came from. And so we're sort of a bit of a consulting investigation firm, but we are available to all of you if you have sort of basic questions. We don't take too many calls from the general public or from non-law enforcement agencies, but we do take them. And if it's something as simple as you're not sure what to do, or you have more questions about maybe something we talked about here today, you can call either Tom or myself, and we'll get you our contact information. And we can put you in touch with people. If we can't answer your questions, we can put you in touch with people, whether it's at Treasury. You've got our contacts here in Lara, someone in the Attorney General's office, and we'll make sure that we get you straightened away. So having said that, in our little sales pitch for our in-house investigator, do we have any questions? Yes, sir, in the middle. Oh, okay. They're going to pass you. They're going to pass a microphone over to you.
Thank you.
Okay. We have a fellow who's got an internal microphone, so.
You do, because we're taping this for.
Oh, okay. I guess they need to.
I don't know if I want to be recorded, though. Well, the first question is are you part of the state of Michigan, or are you an independent operation yourself?
So that's a good question. It's a little bit of both. We're kind of like the MEDC. The Prosecuting Attorneys Association is provided for by statute. There's a statute that says that the prosecutors are to create one. It's kind of one of those unfunded mandates that Michigan loves so much. But in terms of the way we're actually incorporated, we're a private nonprofit owned by all of the 83 county prosecutors in the state. Now, having said that, all of my funding comes from the state of Michigan because we have contracts. In the case of my division, our money and Tom's money flows from the Department of Health and Human Services. Some of the other units that are sort of in their own silos within the Prosecutors Association get funding from, if not DHHS, some of its federal funding. We have VOCA grants and things like that, or money from other parts of the state of Michigan. I know that we have traditionally got some money from MCOLs or from the state police to do different kinds of training. So people, to confuse that even more, if you try and email me, it's a michigan.gov email, and I am considered a state contractor. So it's a little bit of both. But we are not, to make it clear, we are not a law enforcement agency under state statute, for instance. But we do have an investigator, and he does do a lot of investigation work for local law enforcement agencies. Clear as mud, right?
Yeah, that was great.
So.
One other question, or a point of reference, is that you were talking about the trust, and
Sure.
you're not as crazy about them, you don't understand them as much. But I would say a living trust, you hold all the control until you die, until you get to a point where maybe you can't manage your own affairs, and then your trust would then direct that the successor trustee would take over. I just think, I like myself trust better than going through probate. So that would be a direction that I would just say a little differently than what you were looking at there too.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with you. There is case by case, there is some definite value to a trust versus probate. I think too often it's held out as the general fix, sort of the one size fits all. And no matter what it is, whether it's a trust or a power of attorney or any other sort of legal vehicle we create, we just have to get away from that idea that it's one size fits all, because that's definitely not true. And in some cases, the probate's really not going to be that onerous or expensive. Probate, we have a scary view of probate as being incredibly expensive and difficult. Sometimes it can be, but it isn't always. So we really have to have that sort of case by case viewpoint. But that's an excellent point. I thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Next, I'm not sure who was next. I think up there.
Yeah, so my question is similar to what the other gentleman asked. It's about trust you were talking about. So trust, probate, power of attorney, between the three of them, or is there any other alternative, a fourth one? Which one is better? Or is it like one size does not fit all, and you have to go case by case basis?
That's a really good question. And I suspect, and stop me if I'm putting words in your mouth, I suspect what you're getting at is, despite the possibility that probate's more expensive, it would seem like you're safer if a probate court is maybe in the loop or kind of viewing things, looking over things. That's oftentimes not the case at all. I can't really say that one is better than the other. What I will say is this. I think in this country, really, we have a lot of trust, a lot of institutional trust in our court system. I'm not going to say that's misplaced. What I will say is that we have a long, long road ahead of us in terms of fixing some chronic problems within our probate courts in particular. It's not for lack of good judges. We've got a lot of great judges, but they're misapplying the law. They're making a lot of mistakes. We had two different statewide elder abuse task forces created in the last 15 years or so, and both of them made certain kinds of recommendations for things that our court system could do better. And while largely, to its credit, the Supreme Court Administrator's Office and the court system did adopt most of those officially, I can tell you anecdotally that so many of our probate courts simply are not following those recommendations or those new rules. And in fact, our new Attorney General has just within the last week or so, created a third new task force to address a variety of different issues in the state relating to vulnerable adult abuse. One of them is related, however, focused on the issues with our probate courts and the way they administer cases, the way they administer trusts, for instance, probate. And I know that the state Supreme Court has teamed up with the Attorney General's office in that endeavor as well. So I don't know if that's exactly the question you asked, but that's my chance to talk to the audience about what's going on. Generally, though, my answer is going to be there is no perfect. It's going to depend on what county you're in, what your judge is, who the attorney is, how knowledgeable they are.
Well, my question, the second part of the question then
Sure.
is, many of my clients come to me and ask, okay, I went to the lawyer and they said, set up a trust. So that's the default answer by all the lawyers. I go to the local library and almost all the books I see is about trusts and estates. Nothing about probate court. Very rarely I see books on those. So is it that the system is geared more towards setting up trusts? The lawyers and the attorneys are saying, set up a trust. That's the default answer.
Yeah, I think it probably is set up that way.
Or is there something which, in your opinion and judgment and experience, you suggest is a better alternative to setting up a trust?
Well, again, I'm not trying to suggest that trusts are bad in and of themselves. I'm simply suggesting that the trust is the one-size-fits-all, and it's not always necessary.
So what are the things
There could be cases, for instance, with a fairly small, an estate with fairly small assets that maybe really wouldn't benefit that much from a trust, or a situation where, okay, we had a case, this is probably 8 months ago, we had a couple, both of them had been married previously, had kids from previous relationships. Those kids are now adults. When these two folks got married, they wanted to be able to preserve assets for their individual families, and so it seemed like a trust. Well, this made a lot of sense in their situation. But what happened was, she passed away first, which is a little bit unusual. So now we have this elderly widower who had, come to find out, cancer. He tried every treatment that was available, nothing seemed to work. There was an opportunity, he applied for and was given permission to try some kind of new test treatment, but it was in Europe. It had been qualified under their medical scheme over there by the EU. The FDA had not yet approved it. And because the FDA hadn't approved it, it didn't qualify for expenditure under the rules of the trust. There was a ton of money there, he couldn't get at it. And it's because when they set up the trust, they never thought that maybe he would have medical expenses that wouldn't automatically just be paid for by his insurance and by Medicare. So he ended up trying to fight the trust, his wife's trust that was supposed to provide for him until he died, and then, you know, the remainder of the assets would go back to her grown kids and their kids and so on. He ended up passing away before he was successful. Now, who knows? Maybe he would have gone to Europe, they would have tried their fix, and it wouldn't have done anything. We don't know. But I can guarantee you, at the very least, I know this to be true. If his wife was still alive, and she knew that that was the outcome of her putting all her assets in a trust in that manner, she wouldn't have done it. She would have done something differently, or she would have created the trust differently. The language would have been different. So that's why I'm saying a one-size-fits-all trust with boilerplate language isn't always the best answer, because no matter how well we craft one, oftentimes we're going to get those unforeseen circumstances that we can't plan adequately for, and our loved ones could end up paying a pretty steep penalty for that. Kind of an outlier. I'm not saying that happens in every case, obviously, but it did happen. So we know that there are problems with trusts. We just have to be really, really careful, and we need to really give a lot of thought into these rather than just sort of, oh, let's create another trust. Let's, you know, this isn't the General Motors of trust. They need to be handcrafted.
So then the last question then is, will a living trust be better in this case, the one you just mentioned?
But again, she had passed away, so it wouldn't have been a living trust for her. It was her money.
Okay.
So probably,
Thank you.
Probably not.
Thank you.
Okay. So if we have a
a situation where we suspect financial fraud. You said your office doesn't normally take calls from the public.
Well, we'll accept your
Who
call.
do we call?
Here's what you do. There is a, and did I put it on here? Of course I didn't. Adult Protective Services of Michigan has a central intake number. You can Google it, it'll come right up. It's very easy to find. And yeah, we'll email that out. And let me give you a brief synopsis on how that works. So central intake, it's the same number that you would call in a child abuse case on. It's Michigan's central intake. It's for any vulnerable adult case, whether it's for any vulnerable adult case or child abuse case. All of the calls that come in are kept confidential. Okay, so no one's going to know that it was you that called. The only way they can get around that is via court order. So even the law enforcement and prosecutor attached to the case will never know who the first person who called was. Okay, so that'll give you some peace of mind. Also, I will say to the effect that bank secrecy laws play any, I don't know if they play any role in what you do or not, but I will say this, the way Michigan created its central intake system, the federal government views that as being in compliance. So I know in situations where I've had lots of bank tellers in the room, they've asked me, can we call APS? Or are we violating our secrecy requirements for our clientele? Under Michigan's system, it's created in such a way, yes, a teller or someone at a bank or credit union could call APS central intake confidentially, and that wouldn't breach any of their duties under a federal statute, as well as Michigan statute. Not all states have that same assurance. There are other states who have created a system that doesn't comply with the federal system. Ours does. So if you call that APS central intake number, they will take it down, they'll investigate it. What they won't do, they won't give you any advice, they won't answer any questions, okay? All they're doing is taking down the information, and then within 72 hours, I think it's within 72 hours, they have to invest. Within 72 hours, I think they have to have a face-to-face, and within 48 hours, they have to have at least made a phone call contact. I might be slightly off, but it's a very quick timeline. One of their workers will make contact either with the victim or the victim's caregiver and try and find out what's going on. They'll initiate an investigation. If they find anything that seems to rise to the level of crime, then they are mandated reporters to law enforcement. So they're actually mandated to then call law enforcement. If you had called law enforcement directly, which is also fine, if you call law enforcement, they are mandated reporters, cross-reporters with APS. So they'll make that phone call to central intake, and they cross-report to one another. If you're looking for answers, if you have a squirrely situation that you want to talk over, you can call us. You can call Tom and I. You got my number, you've got my michigan.gov email address. Contact me and I'll be happy to talk it through with you and see if I can answer your question. If I can't, I'll direct you to the person who can. What I will say is if you do suspect something's going on, it's always better, even if you're not entirely sure what it is, it's always better to report and be wrong. Nothing's going to redound on you in any way. You're not going to be in trouble. Just report it. Let them investigate it. Let them see if they can find out and do some footwork for you. We've had that situation with banks. Well, I wasn't sure if it was elder abuse. I wasn't 100% sure, and so we didn't call. Call. If you're 20% sure that it's elder abuse, call. Let them figure out, let them sort out the wheat from the chaff. That's an excellent question. I think.
One more question, then I promise he'll be out there and answer all your questions. I've seen him in his face a long time. Who was the last question?
The term or concept of fair, reasonable compensation for executing or being in that position, do you see that as an area of issue?
Oh, sure.
Is there any standard definition, or how do you?
No. It is a gray area. That is an excellent question. What I will say, though, is that the Michigan statute for elder abuse, for vulnerable adult abuse, was amended a few years ago, and so one of the terms that's in there is actually unjust enrichment. And that's really weird because that is a civil legal theory. You do not see that anywhere else in the entire Michigan's criminal code. Actually, someone from the Attorney General's office was able to sort of smuggle that into the final language when the legislature passed it. So in this very limited circumstances of cases involving vulnerable adult financial abuse, if you have a caregiver who is being paid, and of course they're allowed to be paid, no one expects you to work for free, but if they're being paid what seems to be an exorbitant amount in relation to the value of the product or service they're providing, we can look at that and we can potentially prosecute that. Now, there's gray area there. It's not always clear what that service is, but you know, if someone's providing skilled nursing care, that's going to be paid at a much, much higher level, clearly, than someone who just hops in their car and takes grandma to the doctor's office twice a month and gets her groceries once a week. Because we've seen those cases where someone's providing just basic kind of gopher duties. Someone, an Uber, you know, you call an Uber and the Uber could just about do it for you. And in fact, that's actually a pretty good price point. And we've done that. Tom can tell you, we've looked at taxi rates. What would it cost someone to take a taxi to get groceries 4 times a month and take her to and from the doctor's office twice in a month? What would a taxi cost? Taxi's going to rip you off, but it's going to be a standard amount. So if you're beyond that, if you're beyond what the taxis are charging, and if on top of the expense you also have, you know, a $40 an hour rate or something, you're getting at the point where we're going to start taking a pretty jaundiced view of that. One of the wisecracks that I've heard in these trainings is we had a former elected prosecutor who does some trainings for us. He says, you know, I was making over $100,000 as the prosecutor. For the money that they were charging for that, I'll do it. You call me, it'll come up on my pager. I'll come over 3 times a month and mow your lawn. I'll get all your groceries. It'll be the black Lincoln that pulls in your driveway. That's the prosecutor of the county. He's bringing you your grocery because the rate is that good. I can fit that in my daily schedule. And it's only half a joke. I mean, when the rate does get to be that excessive, it's clearly fraud. Is there a bright line? No. Are we going to give you the benefit of the doubt? I think we have to, because we can't get it past a jury otherwise. It's got to be excessive. But when it is excessive, when it is egregious, yes, those can be prosecuted because the unjust enrichment language is in the statute. It actually provides for that. Excellent question.
Okay, first of all, thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.